So now from this settled place, hopefully we can listen to the richness of the gospel today. It's a short reading, but a pithy reading. So let us listen once more. This is from Matthew 18, verses 1 through 5. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a child, who he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So, greatness. Since I love basketball, I was a little interested when recently there was a conversation in the sports world about who is the greatest point guard of all time. Is it Magic Johnson or is it Steph Curry? And some of us who are Warriors fan will cry out, "Steph Curry, of course." And those of us who like the Lakers would probably vote for Magic Johnson on some level. And sportscasters came out of the woodwork to talk about this argument. Who's the greatest and why they're the greatest? How could this be? Even the great Michael Jordan weighed in on the subject. And it's not only basketball, but how many of us have weighed in on some of these different conversations about who is the greatest on a variety of different subjects? Often it seems like there is somewhat of even a preoccupation in our culture to establish or at least figure out who is the greatest of this, of that, of this other thing. I mean, around election time, get ready for it, because it's not too far away. We're going to hear politicians all over the place talk about the phrase, "This is the greatest country in the world. This is the greatest this is the greatest that. We're a part of the greatest this." We're going to hear this language. And as I hear that conversation, I actually have to giggle to myself. Because it's interesting to wonder what all those proclamations are actually based on. Because one of the intriguing things to me is the United States actually is the greatest country in the world at mass shootings. And I'm betting everything in my pockets that that's not what the politicians are talking about. They're talking about power. They're typically talking about influence, about money, things like that. And what we find over and over again in the teachings of Jesus is that he really does see things in a different way. And he's actually trying to get us to that different vision. And then he's actually trying to hold us accountable to that different vision as well. Greatness and all its trappings are certainly one of the things that he envisions very differently than our world tends to envision them. So last week, it seemed like my sermon seemed to really stir something for a lot of folks. It seemed to offer a different kind of vision, different conversation about the cross than people had heard before. And somehow it clicked for people in a more profound way, for some. And I'm glad for that. I like to think that is what Jesus was trying to get people to that different way of thinking about things. And today, hopefully, is an extension of that and is no different. Jesus turned the hierarchy of the world and its social ranking on its head when he was talking about greatness. He had a very different image of it. And I want you to just to think for a second, can you imagine the conversation between Jesus and the disciples? When the disciples asked him, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" I frankly love thinking about Jesus going, "Oh my gosh, you just don't get it, do you?" Because even that question shows that the disciples are thinking in a way that is based in the ways of the world. Because I don't think Jesus would ever kind of have that kind of language about who's the greatest, the best, the most powerful. What does the greatest mean in God's understanding? It's fascinating that Jesus seemed to think that it was like putting a child at the very center of things. And I'm not sure we can totally understand that, at least from the gospel perspective this morning, because it's a complete upheaval. From a cultural standpoint in that time, children were considered not necessarily cute and adorable the whole time, but also considered to be among the least of these, because the mortality rate was incredibly high. People didn't consider children to be fully human, really, until they had matured and could fend for themselves. And so for Jesus to put a child at the center, after, in answer to their question about who's the greatest, would have been completely topsy-turvy. I mean, think about it. In that culture, the full-grown male was the height of things. And then rulers were greater than peasants, and kings were greater than local rulers, and of course God was greater than kings. That's a clear hierarchy. And in some ways Jesus takes it and flips it over and says, this is the way you're supposed to think about being great. What in the world is that about? So when we say great, what do we mean? Don't we mean a person is great when they excel at the particular activity that they are participating in? Or that they best exemplify the values that they're being focused on or they're being held up? So for example, the great point guards do the point guard things, dribbling, passing, shooting, setting up other players, better than regular point guards who do them better than the rest of us who can't do it at all. And that makes sense, correct? That's how we get to great. But then what about being great in the kingdom of God? Now, can't we say that when we think about Jesus, he was great because he embodied the values of God incredibly well? He embodied what he thought God was all about very well, maybe the best that we've known. I actually don't think we have any great Christians today that are in the limelight, in the public eye, with a public voice, because that's not what they would be seeking. It's not a value that the gospel seemed to hold up, seeking the limelight. So Jesus was great because he exemplified love, wisdom, awareness of God's presence, calling out injustice, standing up to the abuses of the religious system where it wasn't really serving the needs of the people, exhibiting healing power, compassion, true humility. You might think of what else you'd add to that list, where you think of him as great, what he embodied in that. When Jesus put the child at the center of the conversation, hopefully he brings all of us up short on what makes a person great in God's eyes. My hope would be, it would be a moment for us. A what is he talking about moment for us? Because it's not the loudest, it's not the strongest, or the wealthiest, or the best looking, or the fastest, or the one with the biggest congregation, or the largest following. It's also not the one who gives the most to the church, or who attends the most church meetings, or is the most involved. Do you see how all of those are measurements of our social structures in competition and proving ourselves rather than truly being based on embodying the values of God? So to push it just a little bit farther, as I like to do, we have often been taught that Jesus' greatness is based on being this conquering hero that conquers the sin of the world. And just like last week, our images and our theology matter a lot. If we've been taught that he is the great conquering hero, then we often think of him as great in the sense of strong and tough and being a fighter. And that's not all wrong, I'm not saying that, but we also hear from him today something that's totally different. We hear about humility. We hear about, in some ways, the least of these being the greatest. It's meant to mess with what we think of as great. It is meant to really work to turn upside down the hierarchy that the world proclaims, to say that the reign of God is about something else completely. And, like that darn bike video, it may be difficult for us to adjust. I've just started reading our new book that we chose for the anti-racism book group. And it begins with a look at the doctrine of discovery and its devastating impact on the world. For those who don't know, doctrine of discovery was an official doctrine of the church that encouraged colonialism by saying that the church supported and encouraged European countries to go into the rest of the world and claim lands for their countries in the name of God. And of course, the problem was those lands were already occupied by indigenous people. So I wonder how things would have been different if the church had really embraced the kind of greatness that Jesus was actually teaching. What if instead of seeing God as the conquering one, or Jesus as the great conqueror of sin, we could have embraced this teaching and maybe heard Jesus teaching that the people that the church saw as the least of these were actually the ones that we were supposed to uphold and embrace instead of conquer. Again, theology and imagery, our symbols, our understandings, they matter. They inform us, they instruct us. And often as a church, we've got them drastically wrong. What if when missionaries had gone to other countries, they had tried to be great by embodying the values of God, like love, compassion, kindness, and also gentleness and self-control? What a different world we would be living in now. Taking it one step further, narrowing it down, bringing it into the current moment, what if instead of trying to be great in all of the outer ways that we do, trying to dress for success, trying to impose, convince people of our way of doing things, we were actually striving to be great in listening, striving to be great in uplifting others, being compassionate to those who have been hurt, really working to see what we deem to be the least of these, to see them as those that God deeply loves. What a difference we would make in this world and in our community. And this might be a mind bender for you, to take it just a little farther. What if those things that we deem the least of these inside of us, within us, were things that we could have compassion for, things that we could be great at tending within ourselves, things that we could treat ourselves gently with, give ourselves the time and space we need to heal. Be great at that. Stop driving ourselves so hard to overperform. Stop comparing ourselves to everyone else around us. How much healthier might we be? So how we understand greatness does really matter. How God sees greatness really matters. And those two visions can be incredibly far apart. And I'm aware that our understanding of greatness may be ingrained in us like riding the bike in the video, and it may take time and effort and perseverance to change it. But the call of the gospel is to change it and to allow ourselves to pedal in a different way through this world. May we dedicate ourselves to work on it, that we might be ever more aware of the reign of God in our midst and the different kind of greatness that all of us are called to today and all our days. Amen.